All right, time for us to begin. Just as a quick housekeeping note, if you'll go over to your question 14, where it says, how does he apply the same analogy using the bodies of Adam and Christ? And it has verses 45 through 50. Change that to verse 49. And then on the next question, when it says, starting with verse 51 and going down, change the 51 to 50. I've moved everything back a verse there. So, as I've told you before, it's difficult to figure out the questions in anticipation of what I'm going to present. And I guess if I had looked at the way the paragraphs are broken up here in my Bible, I would have guessed that 49 would be the end. So we're on question 12. We just got started on that. This is Paul's final section of this argument about the resurrected body. And before we begin, let's have a prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you so much for another beautiful day, for granting us all safe arrival here tonight, and for those who are joining us on Zoom. We thank you for the opportunity to open your word and study together and to do so without fear. We thank you for the blessing of being able to study together, and the blessing of the word itself and of this letter, and the hope that it gives us, the encouragement and the information that is contained in it that will also encourage us. And we pray for your guidance as we study together. Be with those that are hurting right now and having difficulty physically. Pray you'll be with Mary Carter as she had her stress test, and be with Ruslan as she continues to go through her therapies, and with Melanie as she's about to start her cancer treatments. And be with all the others that are of our number that you know about that need your blessing, and continue to be with us during this study is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. So, Paul dealt with their arguments with regard to the resurrection. Of course, there is a resurrection. And now he's going to talk about the resurrection itself, our resurrection. And, of course, he views the resurrection of Jesus as being a fact because he was a witness of that. But now he's going to move to the manner of the resurrection. What's the mechanics of the resurrection? And that may have been an obstacle for the Corinthians. I think we'll see that as we go along here. And considering how much space Paul devotes to the resurrection in general in this letter is pretty impressive. But he asked the question there in verse 35. Someone may ask, he said, how are the dead raised? And then stating it even more succinctly and clearly, with what kind of body will they come? And mentioned last week that the word body is the key word in this section. He's going to use it 13 times in this section. And I think it's very, as I've been studying it, it's an important point. I was telling a couple of people beforehand, I've been wrestling with this section for 2 days. And not only trying to get a handle on it for myself, but also what to winnow out, what's the best way to present it to you so that you can understand it. We'll see how we do. And basically, there are myriad interpretations out there for what he's talking about here. I'm not going to go through all those. You don't want to hear all that. I already waded through that mud. So I'm just going to give you what I think, and then you can weigh it and see if you agree or if you want to study it even further. So when he asked that question in verse 35, with what kind of body will they come, Paul's response was what? Pardon me?
They were foolish.
Yeah, how foolish, he said. And, and that would come across to us as being very, I mean, can you imagine somebody asking me a question in a Bible class and my first response to them is, how foolish? You know, you would feel sorry for them, maybe for me, wondering when my pink slip was going to be delivered. And it's, to our ears, this sounds really, really harsh. But he's not saying how foolish in the sense that this person has lost their senses. That they've taken leave of their minds. More than likely, Paul is using that foolish in the sense that it's used in the Old Testament. That in that case, they have failed to take God into account here. They're not considering what God can do and what he has done. And listen, as I was thinking about that, we do that all the time. Let me give you a couple passages that I think are good examples of this being used. First one is very familiar to you, Psalm 14 and verse 1. And the second one is Luke 12 and verse 20. Who has Psalm 14:1? You probably could almost quote it. I'll start it for you. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. So it's not that this guy is, left his senses. He's just not taking God into consideration in his life, and that he knows what's going on. And then Luke 12:20. Okay, Greg?
But God said to him, you foolish one, this night is your soul required of you, and the things which you have prepared, whose shall they be?
Okay. So here's the rich man who said, wow, look at all that I've got. I'll tear down my barns, I'll build bigger barns, and what's he going to do? Soul, take your ease. And God said, you didn't take me into consideration here. You're a foolish one. And so, basically when we're looking at this, and again, this is what I think sometimes we do, just because we do not understand how God can do something, is no reason for us to question his ability to do it or his promise to do something. God promises to do something, and we look at it and say, man, I don't see how that's going to happen. And then even maybe adding on top of that, because we don't trust him and don't believe that it's possible, we end up worrying about it. And I can just see God saying to us, while we're worried about something he's promised to do that we don't see done yet, well, how foolish are you that you're worrying about that?
That's a key, If we just stop and think of who they're asking,
right,
and consider who that is.
right. So let me paint you the big picture here. So the big picture is, Paul said there is a resurrection, and they're ready to admit, we talked about this for the last couple of weeks, they're ready to admit that Jesus was raised from the dead. But what about their relatives? What's been happening all along? Their relatives continue to die. And what happens to them? They're buried and they rot. They get corrupt in the grave. And so, my dad was very adamant that he wanted to be buried. He didn't want to be cremated. He wanted to be buried. And I think it was because he couldn't imagine that body could be raised if it was burned. And I asked him one time, because he's in the Navy, I said, when they used to bury people at sea and they just dump them over the side, what happened to those bodies? They're eaten by 500,000 crabs, or whatever is down there. And those crabs are eaten by something else and by something else. And so what happens to the particles of your physical body? They're into oblivion. And what's our problem? We can't imagine
Anyone putting that
how God could put that back together again. How foolish. Everything we see came from what? Nothing. It all came from nothing. So if you don't factor God into it, just because you can't understand, you say, well, this is a puzzler for God. He's not going to be able to figure this one out. Then we're being foolish. And so Paul is going to give some very simple illustrations, and then he's going to come back with a little bit more difficult stuff for us to wrestle with. But I think we'll get through it. So what's the first? What's his illustration? He says, "How foolish." Then what does he say?
Dan, can you tap on your mic? I think it's on, but I just want to make sure. Yeah. All right. Somehow Zoom lost audio. I got to figure that out.
Okay. Is it Mary? I can talk really loud so she can hear me in Port Orchard. So what's his first? What's he say right after "how foolish"?
What you sow is not made alive unless it dies.
Okay, so here you have in your hand a bunch of seeds, and it's an illustration that is, the word itself in this illustration is an agricultural example. How would you describe the societies of this day? More than likely, it's agrarian. They all know about sowing and planting and all of that. And so he says, "Oh, foolish man," basically, you have the answer right there in your hand. And look at what God does in the plant world and what he has done from the very beginning. What you sow, the seed that you sow, does not come to life unless it dies. The word for come to life it starts with Z-O-O, as you might imagine. Then it's P-O-I-E-O, so zoopoeo. It's the same word that's used back in verse 22, where, for as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. So it's the same, come to life. Same word there that that's used of Jesus. And so basically the usage of zoopopio is, I make that which was dead to live. I make that which is dead, I cause it to live. And he says it doesn't come to life unless it dies. So only by the dissolution of the seed has to go through some corruption for the germ of life that's within the seed to be made to operate. I mean, we have seeds. There's seeds in the forest that we have that will only come to life if they go through a fire. There are some seeds that only come to life if they pass through the digestive system of an animal. And that's the only way they'll ever germinate. And so that there's that death of some sort that has to happen there. And so when Paul says what you sow, that's Paul's euphemistic equal of being buried, of a death. And in fact, if you go over to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 12, Jesus is going to use exactly the same illustration in verse 24. John 12:24. Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only as a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." So the same illustration Jesus used in his teaching. So that's the first thing. When you sow, it doesn't come to life unless it dies. Secondly, when you sow, what does he say?
You don't sow a body, you sow a seed.
Yeah, so what you sow isn't what's going to come out. Okay? You don't sow when you plant corn, you don't plant corn stalks. Okay? You plant seeds. So this body that's being planted, and I'm just kind of carrying you along as we go, this body that's being planted is not just merely resuscitated at the resurrection. Okay? Lazarus, the widow of Nain's son, the little boy in Elisha, all of those people were resuscitated. That body was resuscitated. Life came back into that very physical body. And what happened to every one of those people? They died again. Okay? So there wasn't really any change in the body. And so Paul's illustrating our body that is buried to a seed. And not just a seed, it's a naked seed. The Greek word is gymnon, Gymnon, like we have gymnasiums and gyms. A gymnasium was a place where athletic contests happened, and in Greek, the athletes were mostly naked, which is where the gym part comes. That doesn't mean stark naked, but they were naked, and kokon is the seed. And so, and basically, and let's just go ahead. I want to read one other text for you to kind of get it in our head, because Paul's going to explain this later. Let's go over to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I've referred to this before, but let's go ahead and read. I have in my notes read verses 3 and 4, but I'm going to start at verse 1 and read down through verse 5. 2 Corinthians 5, 1 through 5. Now we know that if the earthly tent we live in, what's that? Your body, this one, this physical body that you're in. If what we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. Meanwhile, we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, because when we are clothed, we will not be found naked. For while we are in this tent, we groan and are burdened, because we do not wish to be unclothed, but to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Now it is God who has made us for this very purpose and has given us the Spirit as a deposit, guaranteeing what is to come. Okay, I'm going to look at that passage again a little bit later. But I just want you to see that what we're reading here in 1 Corinthians 15 anticipates what he's going to say in 2 Corinthians 5 as he continues to explain those things in that second letter. So it's planted as a naked seed, and it's raised, clothed with a heavenly dwelling, a heavenly body. And so there's a continuity here that Paul is showing us between what is planted and the plant that comes up from the ground. It's not one-to-one, but there's continuity there. When I plant corn, I get corn. Okay? And the seed has to do what first? Die. So there's corruption there that has to take place, and that causes then reproduction, a new thing. And basically what Paul is saying is what God can do with plants, he can do with you. Okay? So God gives that plant, whatever it may be. If you plant wheat over here and corn over here and an apple seed over here, are they all going to look the same? No, he gives it the body that he decides that it should have. But God gives it a body as he has determined, and to each kind of seed, he gives its own body. So every seed has its own body, unique to its seed. And you don't look at, we're not surprised by that if we plant tomato seeds that we get tomatoes, or radishes, or cactus, or whatever. We know that, and we know in fact every plant is different. And what he's going to do is give the human body, which is the seed in this case, the form and nature that he determines that it will have. Now, I admit, and understandably so, that Paul's making this intentionally vague for us. He's not, it's very easy for me to see a corn and see what grows out of that, and he's not going to tell us specifically what it is. But what he's not vague about is that life arises from decay, that there's a continuity between what's planted and what comes out, and that God is the one who determines it. He's very clear about those things. He's just vague about what specifically that body is going to be like. And again, I've sent you to this passage many times. I would send you there again, 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2. And this was written by the Apostle John. Did the Apostle John see Jesus resurrected? Did the Apostle John see Jesus at the Transfiguration? Yeah. If in fact that's what that glorified body is going to look like. He doesn't know. But look at 1 John chapter 3 and verse 2. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when he appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Well, we know that we're going to be like him because what is Jesus in the line of this harvest? What is he? He's the first fruit. And we're the rest of the harvest, of that single harvest. So he goes on then to say, everybody understand what he's saying there about plants and seeds and the whole botany part of that. Okay, that's pretty easy for us to understand.
We should, because he's calling them foolish that you don't.
Well, yeah, he's calling them foolish because they can't picture it. Yeah, that's their... And the reason we can see it is why? We've got it right here. Okay? And we've had it for a while. Okay? This is new to them. So, he goes on to say that, in verse 39, all flesh is not the same. So, I will keep taking you back here all the way through this. What's Paul answering? What kind of body will they come with? How are they raised? That is the overriding context of this whole section. Okay? Talking about the resurrection. And when does the resurrection happen? At the end. At the end. Then the end comes, he said already. And so he's still answering that question, and he's answering it still with the natural world, in the natural realm, but now he uses a different term than body. All flesh is not the same. So this is a Greek word sarx, S-A-R-X. Before it's been soma, S-O-M-A, is body. It's going to come back to body before we're done, obviously. We've got 13 times we have to use it up, and he hasn't used it that many times yet. And the Greek here is more precise than our English. He says there's different kinds of flesh. Men have one kind of flesh, animals have another, birds another, and fish another. And let me just ask you, what do you think might be Paul's point in discussing different kinds of flesh? Human, animal, birds, and fish. What's the point? Yes, Emily?
I think he just is trying to tell them, like, you're not going to be raised up like a horse or something.
Okay. Yeah, I think that will come. I think that might be a nice conclusion to that. But, huh?
Unique.
Okay. Yes, they're unique. For what reason? Now, let's keep going. So he first speaks about differences in structure and quality and function. Not all flesh is the same here. It's not the same. Is a fish different than an animal? Is a human different than a bird? The flesh is different. And if it's different here, and all of those were created by God, and so if they're different here, can't we expect something different later? That there could be another body that God is going to prepare. Second, and this is, I think, probably the most important one, is that the flesh of each one of those creatures, man, beast, bird, and fish, is appropriate for its environment. Okay? They're created to live in the way in which God has put it. Birds are made to live in a world that includes flight. So they have feathers and wings and hollow bones, and so there's a difference there, so they can fly. Yes?
That's the reason it bugs me when we talk about the animal kingdom. They include gnats and flies and birds and
everything. But this is plain. Animals are different than birds.
Well, when they use that word for animal, they're talking about things that are alive, creatures that are alive. And ants are a living creature, and so are gnats, and so are snakes. And in fact, he's going to use that term for all of those living things in a minute and pile them all under one heading. Fish, that's a pretty easy one to figure out, that they are created so that they can live in the water and breathe through gills and all of that kind of thing. Animals have differences accordingly, even among themselves. Some animals are created to live in a meadow and eat grass, and some are created to eat the people that live in the meadow and eat the grass. Okay, and then of course, all of them are different than human beings. And on the basis of them being just their flesh, we have human flesh, beast flesh, bird flesh, fish flesh. We don't judge or evaluate them based on those differences. We're all living creatures on the basis of a flesh. It's different, but all of them are exactly the way they ought to be for the environment that God has created them for to live in. And in the same way, the body God will give to us at the resurrection is going to be appropriate for the environment in which we will find ourselves in then. Okay? And I think that's key, so important to understand. The body that's going to be raised is going to be raised in a body that is exactly perfect for the environment in which we are going to be finding ourselves. Okay? Any questions on that? I'm just going through this. Yes, Daniel.
I can't tell exactly how far we got. Can I ask you a question about 40?
Verse 40?
Yeah.
I'll tell you whether we've gotten there. We haven't got there yet.
Okay.
Okay? I'm just starting there. So he then moves from plant and animal life to another dimension, another kind of body. And this now is not flesh anymore. It's not sarx. He goes back to using the word soma, which means bodies. And he says there are celestial or heavenly bodies and there are earthly bodies. And so that's now his focus. And again, his point isn't that there's uniformity in these bodies, the heavenly bodies or the earthly bodies. So let's just, maybe this is Daniel's question. What are the heavenly bodies and what are the earthly bodies? So what are the heavenly bodies?
Planets.
Pardon me?
The planets.
The planets, the sun, the moon, the stars. They're not angels. He's not talking about spiritual bodies here that any number of the angelic hosts and all of their different varieties have. And how do I know that?
In the next verse, he tells us that there's different types of those heavenly bodies.
Yeah, he's going to say there's a difference in them. But what he's trying to get so let me put it this way. Could the Corinthians see a kernel of corn in a cornstalk and understand that? Can they look at a person and a dog and a peacock and a salmon and know that there are differences? Okay? So when we get to heavenly bodies, could they see angels? It's got to be something that they can observe and tell that there's differences. And so Paul is going to talk about the differences of these heavenly bodies. And I think the terrestrial bodies that he's talking about are all those things that we just talked about. Man, beast, fish, and birds. Okay? So things that can be observed, things that can be compared, and since spiritual bodies can't be seen by us, I don't see how Paul could be referring to them here as heavenly bodies. Yes?
So the reason I had a question is because I actually think that what Dick Smith was raising about the categories here, I actually think there is something significant about it. I use the term animal kingdom all the time, but I think that this point about there being animals, fish, and birds is very reminiscent of the creation account.
Yep.
And the way in which those categories were created.
Right.
And then this phrase, and maybe what you're pointing out is that it is a different word than in Genesis, but or describes something different than Genesis, but this sounds a lot like the creation account where it says that there were birds created into the expanse of the heavens.
Okay.
And there were fish in the sea, and the earth sprung forth creatures. And so I assumed that this was talking about heavenly bodies meaning birds, earthly bodies meaning animals,
Right.
beasts,
Right.
whatever.
And I might go along with that, except when I get down to verse 41. And he tells me what the heavenly bodies are. Sun, planets, and stars.
Yeah.
And he's already mentioned birds and his whole point in telling us all of those is that all those different kinds of flesh are perfect for the environment in which God has placed them in. And the Jewish, you had the first heaven and the second heaven and the third heaven. The first heaven is the bird realm, and the second heaven is the planets and stars, and the third heaven is where God is. But I don't think that Paul has that in mind here. I think he's just talking about different kinds of flesh, and that's why he uses that word flesh, is to show that God created all of these different kinds of flesh. Well, why did he have to do that? Because they're suited for the environment. Okay? And he's laying a groundwork for what he's going to say in a little bit. And so now he's taken us over into the heavenly bodies. Yes, there is terrestrial bodies. We just talked about that basically. But he says there are heavenly bodies. But the splendor of the heavenly bodies is one kind, and the splendor of the earthly bodies is another. There's nothing similar to planets and moons and stars to people, dogs, fish, and birds. Okay, but they all have splendor. They all have glory. They all are wonderful. When I came to work, when was it? I think it was 2 days ago. As I pulled in the morning, and the sun was shining, coming from the east, and there was a perfectly, I'll show it to you if you want to see it afterwards, a perfectly round spider web. Spider web. A perfectly round spider web with a spider popped right in the middle. And I just sent it to my kids and wife, and I said, designed or just happened? Because it's obviously that there was a designer involved in that spider doing that. I almost put it on Facebook, but I thought, no, I don't want to do that. But everything has its splendor. Everything has its glory. And the earthly has one kind, and the heavenly planets and things have another. And that's what he says in verse 41. The sun has one kind of splendor. We see their light, we see their radiance, they are visible to us again. The earthly terrestrial things that he mentioned in verse 39, they all of them have their doxa, D-O-X-A. You may have heard, in fact, there used to be a song in our old songbook when I was growing up. It was called Doxology. And it was just a song of praise to God. And that's what doxa means. It talks about its glory, its splendor, its renown, its honor. And the splendor, the glory of each one differs from the other. Even the heavenly glory differs. The radiance of the sun is different than the radiance of the moon. In fact, we know that the radiance of the moon is what? It's a reflection of the radiance of the sun. And they both, the sun and the moon, differ from the stars. And in fact, Paul says here, even the stars differ from one another in splendor. And, we know that. We know that there's red giants and yellow dwarfs and all kinds of those different kinds of things there. So what he's done, he's established the differences in all of these bodies, both kinds that live and the other things that God has created. And so now he makes his application, and that's where we're starting with question 13. But I want to make sure everybody's with me so far. I don't want to leave anybody behind. Yes?
I guess the thing I'm struggling with, this whole explanation is, at least, I think it's easy to understand it. So far, I've understood it very simply. But the thing that is weird for me is it just feels like such a non sequitur from the actual question. So I'm wondering if the question that they have asked is not translated properly.
No, it is translated properly. What you don't understand is the standpoint from which they're asking the question. Yeah, no, just their understanding. So let me just give you a little hint about that right here. The question of whether or not there is a life after death, a life that's post-mortem, let's put it that way. It's not under question here. The Corinthians understood that. But their view of what that was is completely different than what the truth was. And so they saw this life, it's like, I don't know if it's Buddhism or Hinduism, that you just become one with the universe. So their view of life after death is, I guess it's Buddhism, is that you now find yourself one with everything else. You're still there, but you're just one of everything. I think it's in Hinduism, you just get to keep coming back in different forms. Their view would be, yes, there's life, but this idea of being raised from the dead, that body is going to be raised, that's not possible. And that's the question. How are the dead raised? They're asking that question from a standpoint of, there's no way it can happen.
Okay, so it is like a tone. It's like
They're saying, you say, what kind of body is that going to be? You know, and of course we would be thinking zombies. That's what our minds would go to. But they've been in the grave too long to even be zombies because there's nothing left. And so that's the point of view that they're having then, and they're not understanding it. Which is why Paul said, when you plant that seed, nothing happens until that corruption takes place with that. That's a prerequisite for the plant to grow. Okay? And then he went from the idea of corruption to now, look at, there's all kinds of bodies that God has created. Every one of them is created perfectly for the environment in which it is, and the purpose for which God has it. And so now Paul is going to, and this is question 13, how does Paul apply the above analogy to our bodies in verses 42 through 44? And notice how he starts verse 42. So will it be with the resurrection of the dead. So he's saying, what I've just told you will explain to you what the question that you asked back in verse 35. That there's this variety of bodies in God's creation, each with its own splendor, each with its own glory. And if we can see and differentiate that, we who see that with our own eyes, this is observable by us, shouldn't have difficulty realizing that God can give an even greater, while different glory to the bodies that he raises from the grave. Okay? And so he says, so it will be with the resurrection of the dead. Man, I wish we only had like 40 minutes longer. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to just touch on these right now, because it's going to be 2 weeks till we come back. So because Paul is going to give 4 repeating clauses here of sown and raised, sown and raised, sown and raised. And in doing that, he's going to keep alive this analogy that he started with regard to the seed and what's planted and the body that comes out of that. So there are essential differences between what Paul is saying, essential differences between what you bury in the ground and what's coming out at the resurrection. And each phrase I said describes the condition of the body. First, when it is buried or sown. Secondly, when it is raised. And the first 3 he gives us have direct opposites. I mean, they're totally different than what was put in as to what comes out. So I'm going to go, well, I got 5 minutes and I'm not even going to take that much time, but I'm going to stop when I get through with this. So the present body, he says, is subject to decay. That's the first thing. It's sown is perishable. Okay? And what's going to happen when it's raised? What's its state going to be? We're going to just go right through this real quick and come back. Imperishable. Incorruptible. Okay? The present body is sown in weakness. We'll discuss what that means. God's going to raise it with power, dynamis. And really, more power than you have now. The power that you're going to be raised with is more power than you have now. Finally, the present body is going to be sown a natural body. And so Paul switches here the analogy to a different kinds of body given earlier. And rather than talk about how it was sown and how it was raised, he speaks of the present state and the future state. And so it's sown a natural body. It's going to be raised a spiritual body. Okay?
I think Dan, I think we skipped over the sown in dishonor and raised.
Oh, you're right. I did. Thank you. Yes, I forgot the second one. Sown in dishonor. But God's going to raise it with glory. Okay? Every one of these is exactly the opposite, which is, no, that's how God works. You know, you put it down one way, when he brings it back, it's going to be completely different and better. Different and better. Yes?
When I was looking at it, if you want to, okay, now we're going to go open up this grave right here, we're going to look at this body. Would you want to do that?
No.
But when it's changed, it's going to be, I want to see
Yeah.
what that body's
Yeah.
like, the radiance of
Yeah.
glory from
Yeah.
that body. It's going to be
Yeah. So, and then the final one is it's sown a natural body, but it's going to be raised a spiritual body. So the Greek words there, the Greek for natural is psychikos or psychikos. And we'll look at all of this. And when God created man in Genesis 2nd chapter and verse 7, he put man together and he breathed in him, and man became a psychikos, a living soul, a living being. Okay? And then we have the pneumaticon soma, the spiritual body, which I don't even know what it's going to look like. I don't know what that means. If I go over to 2 Corinthians 5th chapter, it's going to be a dwelling, a house that God makes. And I know from what I just read, it's going to be perfect for the environment in which I will be. Okay? Yes, Tim.
I was just thinking about God's ways higher than our ways, and thinking of Paul as, he's being inspired to say all this, and he's just like us going, cool.
Yeah.
I don't know what it means.
Right. Well, it's like John says, I don't know what it's going to be like, but we're going to be like him. And he had a body. He had a body. And I will tell you that this is my opinion now, underline Dan's opinion, this is it. When he came out, he had a body that was the spiritual body. His body, if he's the first fruits, then the body that he came out of the grave with 3 days later is the same body that you and I will be raised with. And I don't know how to explain it, and I don't want to even try. I don't want to even have to think about that I need to. I believe Jesus Christ was raised from the dead. They saw him alive, they saw him in that body, they recognized him, and we're going to have the same. Okay?
I have more fun trying to just think about those things, because they didn't recognize him when they were walking along the road to Emmaus, right? Some
Yeah.
way he was able to keep his form.
Well, because it's sown in weakness and it's raised with power.
Power and glory.
So he can do what he wants with it.
And so, and when he came in, the door was locked, and he came in
Yeah.
there too. He could control the
Yeah.
things around
Yeah.
that body. He
Yeah.
wasn't subject to the same physical things.
And then you have, what is it? I just quoted this, is it Peter? We beheld his majesty, his glory. They saw it. In fact, the people on the road to Emmaus said, why didn't we see that? Why didn't we recognize that? And they run all the way back to Jerusalem to say what we saw. So, excuse me, when we get back through this and go through the specifics of what we just went through in 2 weeks, and I didn't want to leave you, I want you to think about it. You've got 2 weeks to meditate on verses 42, 43, verses 42 and 43 and 44. And Just try to figure out what that is and understand, not the specifics, not the, what it feels like or anything like that. I just want you to see the picture of what God is having Paul draw for us of the resurrected body. Yes, Josh?
I was thinking about what you mentioned in the beginning of the class, kind of calling them foolish. And it kind of reminds me of when it says what's wisdom to man is folly to God. And it just makes me think that what Paul's trying to tell them is that your man-made understanding and vision of what happens to bodies and spirits in the afterlife is nothing in comparison to actually
Right.
telling you what's
Right.
going to happen
Right.
in the afterlife. And I think he was trying to get them out of that way of thinking, because
Right.
they're just so stuck on what they have drawn up
Right?
through culture,
Through their pagan teaching that they'd had, yeah?
It was kind of a combination of things.
Right.
But
Even-
it's wisdom on man's understanding.
Even Ephesians 3 comes in here, that God can do more than you can ask or even imagine. And so it's going to be, I will tell you what it's done for me, and I hope it'll do for you, is I can't wait to have that. I can't wait to have that body. And that's what Paul said in 2 Corinthians, the 5th chapter there. I long to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling. That's what he said there in verse 2. Because when we're clothed, we won't be found naked. We groan and all of that in this body, but to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. That's going to be amazing. And what I want you to, again, this is my last statement here. I know I've already gone 3 minutes over. When do you get that body? At the end. It happens at the resurrection. It doesn't happen when you die. Paul doesn't say there's life after death. Paul says there's life after the resurrection. Okay? And I'll explain that in 2 weeks too. Okay? Isn't this exciting? I'm excited.
So let's sing 583. Sing to me of heaven, sing that song of peace. From the cords that bind me, it will bring release. Burdens will be lifted that are pressing so. Showers of great blessing for my heart will flow. Sing to me of heaven, let me fondly dream of His good and glory, of His promise daily gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sing the sweetest song of all. Sing to me of heaven as I walk alone, dreaming of the comrades that so long have gone. In a fairer region among the angels throng, they are happy as they sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, where we fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sing the sweetest song of all. Sing to me of heaven tenderly and low, till the shadows o'er me rise and swiftly go. When my heart is weary, when the day is long, sing to me of heaven, sing that old sweet song. Sing to me of heaven, where we fondly dream of its golden glory, of its pearly gleam. Sing to me when shadows of the evening fall. Sing to me of heaven, sing the song of all.
And our next song will be number 758, When This Passing World Is Done.
Good evening.
couple of years ago, I heard a sermon, and the preacher used an illustration of a harsh landlord, and then the individual signed with a new landlord, yet that harsh landlord kept coming back and harassing the new tenant. The devil is like that. The devil is always going to come back and seek us and try to get us, no matter how much we follow God. We also know that in 1 Peter 5, verse 8, that the devil walks about like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. He knows where to find us and how to lure us back in. The devil found Samson in the arms of pagan and immoral women. He found Judas where power and money was traded. And he found Jesus hungry and tired in the desert, alone and struggling in the garden. He always knows where to look in order to find us and lure us back in. He finds you online because there's stuff on there that you should not see. In your car in heavy traffic, when you're in a hurry and least patient. When you are broke and would compromise honesty and generosity to get what you want. After a fight, insult, or offense is when revenge is planned. He knows exactly where to find you in order to devour you and draw you into your sin. However, there are places he cannot get to us. This is where we need to be, in the Word, in prayer, worshiping, fellowshipping, and serving with other Christians. These are the places he knows that he's not welcome and his power is severely undermined. If he has found you, it's because you are where you should not be. Be aware of these places and avoid them. The devil will always try to get you to come back to those places. When attacked, stand firm. But how do we do that? Say no. Avoid those places. Seek God's help. Lean on him. Pray to him, and he will defend you.
Amen.
Try to fill your time and find those places where God is and the devil is not. This is how you can avoid the devil. Tonight, if you feel like the devil is tugging at you and wants you to leave and come back into the world, you have this time to be able to correct that and be with fellow Christians as we stand and sing.
758.
When this passing world is done, when has some